On an unexpected morning filled with mystery, a young gas station attendant, his eyes alight with determination, scribbles a cryptic message on Keanu Reeves's receipt, sensing that time is running out and that something monumental is about to unfold. The pain hit Keanu like a freight train as he stumbled toward the pharmacy counter, vision blurring around the edges. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the store's aggressive air conditioning. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making the shelves of medicines swim before his eyes. "I need..." Keanu's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again, forcing a steadiness he didn't feel. "I need my prescription. Reeves. Keanu Reeves." The pharmacist, young, maybe mid-20s with intelligent eyes, studied him with barely concealed concern. "ID, please." Keanu fumbled for his wallet, his trembling fingers betraying him. The plastic cards scattered across the counter. "Sorry," he mumbled, gathering them up as the line behind him grew restless. "It's fine," the pharmacist said, voice gentle as she examined his license. Her name tag read, Emily. "Mr. Reeves, your prescription isn't due for refill for another 2 weeks." The words landed like a physical blow. "There must be some mistake," Keanu said, desperation rising. "Check again, please." "I'm sorry, but you don't understand." Keanu leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I lost them. The bottle fell. I need them." Something shifted in Emily's expression, suspicion clouding her professional demeanor. She'd seen this before. "I can't refill this early without authorization. These are Schedule 2 medications. You'll need to contact your doctor." Keanu felt the eyes of everyone in line boring into his back. The judgment, the assumptions. His chest tightened, the familiar squeeze of panic setting in. "My doctor's out of town," he lied, knowing how it sounded. "Please, I just need enough. Until..." "Sir," Emily cut him off firmly, "I understand you're in a difficult position, but I cannot legally..." "You don't understand anything." The words exploded from him, echoing through the suddenly silent store. Shame followed instantly, washing over him as he saw the pharmacist flinch, her hand moving slightly toward what he assumed was a panic button. A security guard appeared, at the end of the aisle, watching carefully. Keanu stepped back, hands raised. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the fight draining from him. "I didn't mean to..." "I'm sorry." He turned away, leaving his scattered cards on the counter, and lurched toward the exit. Each step was agony, not just from the physical pain that had been his constant companion for 8 years, but from the weight of what he'd become, what Hank had seen coming long before he did. Keanu made it to his car, just as the first tear fell. He didn't deserve to cry. Not after everything, not after what happened 3 days ago, not after what he'd done. The phone in his pocket vibrated. Detective Alvarez again. Keanu let it ring out, staring blankly at the pharmacy through his windshield. Whatever happened next, he knew with absolute certainty that his carefully constructed life of lies was finally, catastrophically, coming undone. 8 years earlier, Keanu Reeves had everything under control. At 32, he was the youngest project manager at Meridian Construction, overseeing the development of a 20-story luxury apartment complex downtown. His colleagues called him the Machine, not always affectionately, for his relentless efficiency and attention to detail. 12-hour workdays were standard. Weekends were for catching up on emails and reviewing plans. "You're going to work yourself to death," Hank would tell him, his tone light but his eyes serious. His best friend and roommate understood ambition. As a veteran paramedic, he had his own demanding career, but he worried about the toll Keanu's perfectionism was taking. "Just until we finish the Meridian Heights project," Keanu would answer, the same response he'd given for the past 18 months. "Then we'll take that road trip along Route 66. I promise." On a rainy Tuesday in April, Keanu was inspecting the 14th floor of the construction site when it happened. Later, he would replay the moment endlessly, searching for something he could have done differently. The temporary lighting had been malfunctioning. Keanu stepped carefully around a stack of drywall, phone flashlight illuminating his path, when he heard a crack above him. He looked up just as a section of scaffolding broke loose. Keanu didn't remember the impact. He remembered the rain on his face as he lay on his back, unable to move. He remembered a worker kneeling beside him, panic in his voice as he called for help. He remembered thinking, absurdly, that he would miss his 2:30 meeting. The verdict came after 3 surgeries, 2 crushed vertebrae, severe nerve damage, and a prognosis of chronic, possibly lifelong pain. Keanu received a settlement from the construction company's insurance, substantial enough to cover the medical bills with some left over, and a prescription for oxycodone. Temporary, his doctor assured him. Just to get you through the worst of it while you heal and start physical therapy. 6 months later, Keanu returned to work with a modified schedule and responsibilities. The pain had receded from unbearable to merely constant, a companion that woke with him in the morning and followed him to bed at night. The medication helped. When he took it, the world softened around the edges. He could function. He could pretend to be the man he was before. "I think we should reduce your dosage," Dr. Whitaker suggested at his 1-year follow-up. "The risk of dependency increases significantly after long-term use, and your physical recovery has plateaued." Keanu nodded agreeably while panic fluttered in his chest. That night, he took his usual dose and then, for the first time, one more. It was the beginning of a careful balancing act, showing improvement to his doctor while secretly increasing his intake. He became an expert at managing prescriptions, finding reasons for early refills, occasionally suggesting his pain had worsened to justify higher doses. When that wasn't enough, he found other doctors willing to write prescriptions without asking too many questions. Hank noticed the changes in him, his mood swings, the missing money, the way he would sometimes drift away mid-conversation. But Keanu always had explanations: work stress, pain flare-ups, insomnia. "I'm worried about you," Hank said one night, sitting across from him at their kitchen table. "You're not the same person anymore." "Well, that's what happens when your spine gets crushed," Keanu snapped, immediately regretting his tone when he saw his friend flinch. "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Hank's voice was quiet, but steady. "I think you need help, Keanu. Different help. I think the medication is becoming a problem." "The medication is the only reason I can get out of bed in the morning," he countered. "You have no idea what this is like." "Then help me understand," Hank pleaded. "Let me in, please." But Keanu couldn't. He couldn't admit how dependent he'd become, how terrified he was of the pain returning in full force, how he sometimes took pills not because of physical agony, but because of the emptiness that had taken residence inside him. Their friendship deteriorated in slow motion. Arguments became more frequent, reconciliations more fleeting. Hank threw himself into his work with the paramedic service, while Keanu retreated deeper into his increasingly complicated relationship with pain medication. When Hank finally moved out 3 years after the accident, Keanu told himself it was for the best. Hank deserved a better friend than what he had become. Alone in the apartment they once shared, Keanu perfected the art of functioning while fractured. To his colleagues, he was a dedicated worker who had overcome a terrible injury. To his few remaining friends, he was a man changed by trauma but coping admirably. Only Keanu knew the elaborate system of lies that kept his life from collapsing. The multiple pharmacies, the careful tracking of when he could refill without suspicion, the precise calculation of how many pills he needed to avoid withdrawal. Until 3 days ago, when everything went catastrophically wrong. Detective Lanai Alvarez sat across from Keanu in the sterile interview room, her dark eyes betraying nothing as she observed him. At 45, she carried herself with the steady confidence of someone who had seen it all and was rarely surprised anymore. "Mr. Reeves, I appreciate you coming in," she said, though they both knew it wasn't really a choice. "I have some follow-up questions about the night of March 10th. Keanu nodded, trying to ignore the crawling sensation under his skin. It had been almost 24 hours since his last pill. Too long. His body was beginning its revolt. "You stated previously that you left the hospital at approximately 9:30 p.m. after visiting your friend," Alvarez continued, consulting her notes. "Is that correct?" Yes, Keanu replied, his mouth dry. Hank was on shift until 10. We had coffee in the cafeteria during his break. And what did you discuss? Keanu hesitated. Personal things. He's moving to Arizona to work at a rural clinic. He wanted to tell me himself rather than have me hear it. Elsewhere. Alvarez nodded, making a note. That must have been difficult news to receive. Not really. We've been distant for years. I want him to be happy. Alvarez's non-committal response suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. After you left? The hospital. You claim you went directly home, is that correct? Yes, Keanu said, the lie coming easily after so much practice. I took my medication and went to bed early. I had a project deadline the next morning. That's interesting, Alvarez said, sliding a photograph across the table, because we have footage of your car at a gas station on Woodward Avenue at 10:15 p.m. That's in the opposite direction from your home, Mr. Reeves. Keanu stared at the grainy image of his sedan at a pump, the timestamp clearly visible. His mind raced, searching for an explanation that wouldn't unravel his entire story. I needed gas, he said finally, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. At a station 5 miles out of your way, when there are 3 stations between the hospital and your home, Alvarez raised an eyebrow. And then there's this. She slid another photo across the table. This one showed Keanu at the register inside the gas station, clearly arguing with the clerk. His face was contorted with anger, one finger pointed accusingly. Do you remember this interaction, Mr. Reeves? Keanu's stomach lurched. He had no memory of stopping at this gas station, let alone confronting anyone. The gaps in his memory had been happening more frequently lately, moments and sometimes hours lost to the haze of medication. I may have had a disagreement with the clerk about something, he offered weakly. According to the clerk, you became belligerent when your credit card was declined. You demanded that he run it again, and when he refused, you threatened to make him regret it. Those were your exact words. Keanu shook his head. That doesn't sound like me, I wouldn't. The clerk also stated that you appeared to be under the influence of something, unsteady on your feet, slurring your words. I have a legitimate prescription, Keanu said defensively. For my back, from the accident. Yes, your workplace injury in 2017, we're aware. Alvarez leaned forward. Mr. Reeves, 30 minutes after you left that gas station, another customer found the clerk unconscious behind the counter. She'd been struck with a heavy object, likely the metal flashlight that was missing from the display. The register was empty. The room seemed to tilt beneath Keanu. You think No, that's impossible. I didn't hurt anyone. The clerk, Emily Mitchell, is still in critical condition at Mercy General, the same hospital where your friend works, the same hospital you had just left. Keanu's breathing became shallow. This is a mistake. I didn't do this. We have your car at the scene. We have witnesses who describe someone matching your description. We have your history of increasingly erratic behavior. Yes, we've spoken to your co-workers and neighbors. Alvarez's voice remained even. What we don't have is your direct admission of what happened that night. Because nothing happened, Keanu insisted, panic rising. I went home. Alvarez studied him for a long moment. I believe that you may not remember what happened, Mr. Reeves, but that doesn't mean it didn't occur. Keanu felt himself slipping, the careful facade crumbling. I want a lawyer, he whispered. That's your right, Alvarez acknowledged, gathering her files. But before I go, there's something else you should know. The reason we connected you to this case so quickly is because of a phone call we received early the next morning. She paused, letting her words hang in the air between them. The call came from Hank Mitchell, your former roommate. He reported that you had come to see him at his home around midnight, not during his hospital shift as you claimed, appearing disoriented and with blood on your clothes. He said you were talking about needing money, about mistakes that couldn't be fixed. Keanu's world collapsed inward. Hank had turned him in. Hank, who had always seen through his lies. Hank, who had tried to save him from himself years ago. He was trying to protect you in his way, Alvarez said quietly. He thought we could help you get the treatment you've been avoiding, before someone died." As the detective left the room, Keanu buried his face in his trembling hands. The withdrawal. Symptoms were intensifying. Soon he would be physically sick on top of everything else, but for the first time in years his mind was achingly clear. He had become the thing he most feared, a man completely out of control, dangerous to himself and others. And in that clarity came the most painful realization of all. Hank had been right to leave him all those years ago. He had seen the path Keanu was on long before he was willing to acknowledge it himself. The rehabilitation center was nothing like Keanu had imagined during those terrifying first days of detox in the hospital ward. No institutional green walls or fluorescent lighting. Instead, the facility was designed to feel like a retreat, with natural materials and abundant windows overlooking the mountains. Keanu had been here for 6 weeks now. The first 2 were consumed by the physical agony of withdrawal, the bone-deep aches, nausea, insomnia, and the constant, desperate craving that made every second feel like an eternity. He would have given anything, done anything for relief. Dr. Bennett, the center's medical director, had been unflinchingly honest with him. "The charges against you are serious, Keanu. Aggravated assault and robbery carry significant sentences, but your friend's testimony about your condition and your willingness to plead guilty and commit to rehabilitation have given you an opportunity many don't get." The legal arrangement was complex. Keanu would complete a minimum 6-month inpatient treatment program, followed by 2 years of intensive supervised probation with mandatory drug testing and therapy. The alternative was 7 to 10 years in prison. Now sitting in the sunlit community room for his weekly group session, Keanu listened as others shared stories that mirrored his own with eerie familiarity, the legitimate prescriptions that became dependencies, the lies they told themselves and others, the moment their carefully managed lives imploded. "Keanu?" The group facilitator, Teresa, prompted gently. "Would you like to share today?" He hesitated, still uncomfortable with the vulnerability required in these sessions. But something had shifted in him recently, a growing recognition that his silence had been part of what nearly destroyed him. "My friend Hank is moving to Arizona next month," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. "He wrote to me last week. He's happy, building the life we once planned to visit together, but without me." Teresa nodded encouragingly. "How does that make you feel?" "Sad," Keanu admitted, "angry sometimes, but mostly grateful." He paused, searching for the right words. "Grateful that he got away from me before I destroyed him too. Grateful that he cared enough to turn me in when he realized how far gone I was. Grateful that he's found a new path. That's quite a perspective shift from when you first arrived," Teresa observed. Keanu nodded, remembering the rage and betrayal he'd felt toward Hank in those early days of treatment. "I'm starting to understand that the greatest act of love he could have shown me was refusing to enable my addiction anymore. Both when he moved out and when he called the police. It took me 8 years and nearly killing someone to see that." After the session, Keanu sat alone on a bench overlooking the valley below, thinking about the woman who had nearly died because of him. Emily Mitchell had survived, thankfully, though her recovery would be long. Keanu had written to her, not expecting or asking for forgiveness, but simply to acknowledge the harm he had caused. He didn't know if Emily had read the letter. Each day here was a reckoning, with his addiction, with the pain that had become his identity, with the person he had allowed himself to become. The physical therapy sessions were brutal but effective, teaching him to manage his chronic pain through movement, mindfulness, and non-addictive treatments. The psychological work was even harder, forcing him to excavate the beliefs and behaviors that had facilitated his descent. The craving for pills hadn't disappeared. Keanu doubted it ever would completely, but the power they held over him was diminishing, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: hope. His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Bennett, who took a seat beside him without speaking for several moments. "You've made remarkable progress, Keanu," she said finally, "but I sense there's something still holding you back in your recovery." Keanu stared at the horizon, where the sun was beginning its descent behind the mountains. I keep thinking about what happens after I leave here. Who am I without the pain? Without the addiction? They've been my identity for so long, I'm not sure what's left. Dr. Bennett nodded thoughtfully. That's one of the most profound questions in recovery. It's not just about stopping a behavior, it's about discovering who you are beneath it. What if there's nothing there? Keanu voiced his deepest fear. What if I've been hollowed out completely? Nobody is ever empty, Keanu, she said firmly. Damaged, maybe. Transformed, certainly, but not empty. Your task now is to rebuild, not from the ruins of who you once were, but from the foundation of who you are becoming. As Keanu watched the sunset paint the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, something shifted within him, a subtle but seismic realignment. For 8 years he had been running from his pain, numbing it at any cost. He had lost his closest friendship, his integrity, and nearly his freedom in the process. The weight of these losses was immense, but for the first time he felt strong, enough to bear it. Tomorrow Hank would visit, his first time coming to the center. His therapist had suggested the meeting as part of his amends process, a chance to acknowledge the harm he had caused without expectation of forgiveness. Keanu had agreed, though the prospect filled him with equal parts terror and hope. What could he possibly say to the man whose life he had upended? The man who had cared for him enough to walk away when he was destroying himself, and then loved him enough to turn him in when he was about to destroy someone. Else, there were no words adequate for such a debt. But as the last light faded from the sky, Keanu realized that perhaps words weren't the point. Perhaps the only true amends he could make was to become the man Hank had always believed he could be, even when he had stopped believing it himself. For the first time in 8 years, the silence inside Keanu wasn't filled with the echo of loss or the whisper of cravings. It resonated with something simpler and more profound, the quiet determination to begin again, one moment at a time, carrying the weight of his past not as a burden, but as a reminder of how far he had come and how far he still had to go. "I'm ready," he told Dr. Bennett, and was surprised to discover he meant it.